Hello and welcome to the latest episode of the Unpaid Interns here. It's Monday, September 28th. Austin Render, joined by the man who helped get this podcast up and running, Dr. Galen Clavio, who wears many hats over at the Indiana Media School. Dr. Clavio, very happy to have you along for the ride. How's it been?
It's been good. This is awesome. My baby's all grown up. I love it. It's good to be back.
Well, we had to get you out here. It's been too long since you've been on. Obviously, there's a lot going on. You're a big sports fan. You got Premier League in the mornings, football throughout the day, baseball, hockey, basketball. How have you been consuming your sports here over the past couple weeks in what has been one of the better sports months of recent time?
I've really made time for it. I think even more so than I did before. It's hard to believe back in April and May, we were just sitting around and not watching any sports. Nothing was on. And it just, I didn't know how I would feel about it. And honestly, in June and July, when like German soccer's back and a couple of things else were on, I wasn't that excited. But when football started back up, when the NBA playoffs heated up, I was like, I'm watching as much of this as I possibly can. And so it's been good. It really has been a distraction. It's been something else to think about, both during the games and then kind of in between with the anticipation. So I am very happy that they've found a way to bring sports back and for the most part to be able to do so safely.
Yeah, college sports are kind of back. I mean, football is about halfway back, and the rest are going to join here shortly. Here at IU, going to start up sports in the next month or so with football and then basketball following that. What have been your thoughts of the way the Big Ten has handled its return to sports?
Well, they didn't handle the public relations aspect of it well at all. And I think that like all decisions in this vein, the idea that this was made out of anything other than an abundance of caution is kind of silly. I mean, there's some people with some conspiratorial thoughts. A lot of people back in August were like, the Big Ten wants to kill off football. It's like, that might be the most moronic thing I've ever heard, but the Big Ten has this tendency historically to issue edicts from on high and then just expect everybody to fall in line. And I think that would have worked if everybody else in college football had been like, yeah, too dangerous, not doing this. But instead, the Big Ten could deal with its decision up until the point where you turned on the television and you saw, oh, hey, the ACC is playing. Oh, the Big 12's playing. Oh, now the SEC is playing. At some point, it became a situation where you just could not explain why the best public universities in the country couldn't figure out a way to play football, but the SEC could. And so I think that they definitely failed on that front. And I also think that they created a situation where, they kind of put their coaches and players behind an eight ball in terms of trying to explain things. And so I don't know if there'll be any lessons learned from this. There probably won't be, but I do think that the Big Ten didn't come out of this looking great. Fortunately, it kind of doesn't matter now. And a lot of it's going to really depend on, how effective is this process. And we've already seen other leagues struggling to play games in certain situations. And we saw Florida State didn't even have their head coach this weekend because he's quarantining with the virus. So it's not like it's been smooth sailing across the board. And I do think there'll be a lot more scrutiny now in the Big Ten if that sort of thing starts to happen.
Yeah, what are your biggest concerns as the season rolls around? It's 9 games, it's 9 weeks. There's not a lot of a buffer there. What could be the biggest issue that arises for the Big Ten?
I think it's probably a combination of two factors. One, it's the idea that, back in late spring when we were trying to figure out what was going to happen, the whole reason why we thought we might have football and not basketball was that there was supposed to be this period of time before the flu season really got into full swing when the virus kind of disappeared because it was warm. Well, that hasn't happened. And if anything, we've seen cases going up and up. And I do worry, societally speaking, that things are going to get significantly worse over the next 2 to 3 months in terms of cases, in terms of hospitalizations. Certainly, the politicization of the virus and the presidential election happening in the midst of it all, and states like Indiana deciding to go more open than Sweden in terms of their public spaces, that could have a really negative effect on the ability to play. The other thing I think is worth keeping in mind is, it really only takes one team getting out of kilter in this kind of a schedule for everything to be thrown aside. Like in a 9-week season where you've just got 9 straight weeks, you don't have a lot of room for error, as you mentioned. And what I worry about isn't so much that a game's going to get canceled and a team gets screwed, from a record perspective. I'm more worried about a game that should be canceled but isn't, because the pressures of, we got to play this game and whatever happens. I mean, I think Virginia Tech this week played a game, had 23 players and 2 coaches missing, because that's a terrible situation. And something that, somebody should have probably said, look, we can't play, but I'm sure they look at it and they say, we don't have a choice. And that's a bad spot to put your people in.
It is interesting, isn't it, that it feels like the players are going to do everything they can to play, and they're going to be the most responsible people, but it's going to be the other people, I'm not going to single anybody out, but the people who aren't playing sports, who don't really have anything riding on this fall timeline, that are going to be out there doing their thing and might end up ruining this season.
Well, I think here's the deal. It's like, I don't know if there's a way to do this or that would ruin a season, because you almost have to change your expectations. It's not like COVID-19 went away just because football started, and it's not like people's ability to be outside is going to get better as it gets colder outside. This is what we do as human beings. We move indoors. Now, if everybody's wearing masks indoors, that might end up having a positive effect, but as we've seen from both sports and non-sports situations, you could be doing everything right, and a coworker or a roommate or somebody could get this disease, and then all of a sudden, hey, guess what? You're in quarantine for 2 weeks, and and that, in a tight quarters situation like a football team, when you've still got classes going on, or in a coach's room, I'm still trying to figure out how Mike Norvell was able to quarantine because he had the virus and none of his coaches were close enough to have actually gotten it. That seems implausible, but that's the kind of thing we're talking about, where it's like, it's not just transmission. It's not just, okay, someone messes up and does something stupid. It's also the proximity and the reality of how stuff gets transmitted. It's a really complicated set of scenarios, and I don't blame anybody if something goes wrong. It's just that there's no margin for error, as you mentioned.
I like the alluding to my quarantine situation there. Appreciate that.
I didn't want to come right out and say it, but yeah.
we're on day 6. We're rolling here in the townhouse is on 10th quarantine. Let's transition to here at IU. You play a big role in the Big Ten Student U program. With sports coming back, what might that look like for the students who are trying to get opportunities under the headset?
It might actually make it so that there's slightly more opportunities. For those who don't know, Big Ten Student U is this collaborative program that we have with the Big Ten Network and the athletic department and the media school and our radio TV services department, where our students broadcast about 120 games a year. And it's mostly Olympic sports and women's basketball and baseball, and it's television quality. It's all streamed on the Big Ten's website and on their app, and that's a lot of opportunities for students. And we haven't had any of that so far. Normally, we're doing volleyball, field hockey, men's and women's soccer during this time of year. I think if basketball comes back, both men's and women's, and if you've got a spring soccer season for both men's and women's, there might be even a greater demand for those games and a larger potential audience, because you're not going to be able to go to the games in person. And so that gives me some hope that things will end up working out. The way that stuff gets set up, we're still trying to figure all that out. You're probably not going to have broadcasters at sideline or a sideline reporter in a normal spot, but maybe they're up in a tunnel looking out over the floor for basketball. Camera positions, You're not standing right next to somebody there, so that's easy to do. Control room, okay, maybe you have to socially distance that a little bit more, but that's okay. So I'm still excited about these possibilities, and I feel like as testing gets better, it's going to give both us and athletics opportunities to do things that we normally do, and maybe there's actually some more eyeballs on that because people need to watch the streams as opposed to going to the games in person.
You mentioned the spring season. It could be pretty hectic there for a couple of months. Obviously we sit here in September, but what might that look like in terms of just a sports season and then for student media?
It's hard to say exactly what to expect. A lot of it comes down to what the the scheduling will allow, and I think to some degree what happens over the course of November, December, and January in terms of health and spread. I mean, if there is a testing regimen in place during those times that has shown to be accurate and effective, then I think you are going to potentially have a very crowded schedule in the spring because ultimately, I mean, the big ones are football and men's basketball just from a revenue perspective. And it's one of the reasons why football has to be played kind of regardless right now. It's because everybody needs the money. I mean, there's a lot of money in college athletics. There's a lot of debates about why there's so much money in college athletics or whether there should be, but that doesn't divorce the money from the fact that it needs to be made because that's what pays people's salaries in the athletic department. It's what pays for scholarships, things like that. And so, with that said, what we end up with is a situation in the spring, I think, where almost everybody could be playing a spring schedule simultaneously. And that's a lot of stuff happening at once. They'll probably be shortened. I would imagine I could see situations where, what is normally a 3 month or 2.5 month long volleyball schedule might get compressed a little bit, or a soccer season might get compressed a little bit because you also have to look forward to what you're going to play in the fall and when that might happen. So there's a lot of moving pieces, not just in that moment, but also ahead. But I think I don't have any inside info. I haven't talked with anybody officially about this, but my guess would be across major college athletics, they're going to try to get as many of these seasons in as they can. Very few sports are going to want to be left out of being able to play. And then it's just a matter of venue management. But I think that's something that universities are going to be able to handle.
I think I speak for the both of us when I say that we also want to see Little Five come back as well. There was a gaping hole there in April last of this year that just needed to be filled.
Yeah, I'm into that as well. I really feel like for the entire IU community, that's such a key part of the end of the semester, and it really felt like a hole in the year. I mean, along with the fact that everybody else was missing from campus, that certainly didn't help. But not having Little 500, that whole event is kind of the crowning moment of the spring semester is tough from a sports perspective. And look, I hope that we see a Little 500 run sometime in the spring. It'd be great to have it maybe even pushed slightly later in the calendar. I always remind people that, the IU calendar back prior to like 1974, 1975 used to run all the way through to like the third week of May. And Little 500 always used to be Mother's Day weekend. And so the idea of having a slightly later race might end up being a good thing if you want to wait for the weather to get warmer. It's just, there's so many things that are hard to predict with this. And that, I guess, like, I can speak hopefully about wanting to see the Little Five back and wanting to be able to get us in a position where, as a sports media program, we can broadcast that race. But health and safety comes first. Little Five is a tough one because, it's kind of more like football in a way, where you've got all of these people and they're coming from all different areas, and to try to bring all those people together and make it safe, even if you don't have spectators in the stands, that is a daunting task. And unlike a varsity sport or an athletic department, you don't have the money to pay for the testing that would probably be needed necessarily to do that. So maybe it ends up changing the dynamics of things, or maybe testing becomes so cheap by that point that it just gets built into the cost. So these are all things to keep in mind. I doubt we'll know anything for sure for another couple of months, but we'll keep our fingers crossed.
Yeah, we're all hopeful that something will change. And like I learned this past week, you can't plan too far ahead because all
No.
of a sudden you get thrown into quarantine and all those plans get immediately canceled. Obviously, you and I are huge supporters of student media. We want the students at the games. How important is it in your mind, even during this moment, that we keep allowing the student reporters to get into these games and to cover these games?
I think it's important, and I think it's something that there's challenges certainly from a health perspective across the board with media, trying to make sure that you are doing what you need to do to keep everybody safe. It probably means fewer credentials handed out for being in the press box. It probably means very few credentials being handed out for the field access or floor access. But I do think that student media is just like regular media, and in fact, to some degree, I think has a greater argument to be there than some other outlets, because they do cover things from a student perspective. They are read or watched by students on a more regular basis. And so, look, I think there's a balance there, because when games come back, everybody's going to want to be in the stadium covering the game. I get that. And I look, I think IU as a whole has been eminently fair with student media over the years in terms of granting access and granting credentials, and really across the Big Ten. Like, there's very few Big Ten schools that we've worked with who haven't been fair and who haven't been willing to grant credentials. I do think travel is going to be essentially nil this year for student media. Just like I think travel in general for media is going to be very, very limited. It's just, you're just not going to get that many people from out of town that haven't gone through a pretty strict testing regimen getting into the stadium. So, look, I think it's one of those. It's a challenge, but it's also an opportunity. I was talking with Trisha Whitaker, who's one of our teachers, who also is the sideline reporter for the Tampa Bay Rays, and we've been talking about how the challenges that student media are facing in covering sports right now is the same challenges that ESPN's facing, and that Fox Sports is facing, and that all of these major professional institutions face, because there's just no rule book for trying to cover things like this. And so you have to improvise, and you have to come up with new and innovative ways to talk about what's happening, to show what's happening. And I think that's our challenge right now. So yes, the games are things that I want students to be covering. Probably won't be as many, but let's continue to keep as many people actively engaged in covering the sports as we can, and figure out other ways to talk about what's going on with sports, better ways to contextualize things, and better ways to do reporting.
Let's talk teaching in a pandemic. What has that looked like for you? Do you have anything that's on campus? Have you gone fully Zoom? What has that experience been like?
So the way that the university set things up at the start of this fall semester was essentially that I was teaching a class that was automatically going to be online because it was over 50 people. And so that's fine, because I've been teaching online for years and it's just kind of second nature to me at this stage. So I teach an online synchronous course. It's got the same time block as you would normally have teaching a class, which is what, Monday, Wednesday, 1:10 to 2:25. I normally don't lecture the full time. I normally reserve time for questions or office hour visits or things like that at the end, because they're, in my opinion, you can lecture for 75 minutes in person, and that's frankly kind of feels too long. It definitely feels too long on Zoom. People get Zoom fatigue. It's very difficult to focus and pay attention for that long. So I try to keep the lectures shorter. I try to keep them more to the point, and I try to utilize discussion sections on Canvas, which is kind of our Blackboard, our online, assignment and discussion module here at IU, to supplement what I'm doing in my lectures. I try to use a lot of readings so that people understand what they're getting into and what we're talking about when it comes to various aspects of what I cover, which is sport. I teach a class in media literacy and sports. So trying to understand the media environment within the sports world, trying to understand how sports impacts media, and in the way that, the culture and sport interact with one another. So for me, it's been a pretty easy transition. We've got other people in the media school that are teaching hybrid courses where they're teaching in person and online simultaneously. We've got some folks that are teaching entirely in person. So it's been interesting. And my role, I'm not only a professor, but I'm also the director of undergraduate studies. So I work with all of our instructors in trying to figure out the best way to bring material to students and interact with students in this environment. And it's been a challenge, but a lot of our faculty and instructors have adapted very well. And I think our students have also. There's a kind of a we're all in this together attitude with many of our classes. And that's been exciting to see, just because the adaptations that you hope would be happening in teaching methods and also learning methods seem to be happening across the board. And so that in general, I think is a good thing.
You mentioned the shorter classes, trying to keep people engaged. What are some of the other keys to making this online learning still effective?
So I think the biggest thing is you have to have a clear sense in a week to week format, at least, if not longer than that, of what the outcomes and the objectives are. Like, what is it that we're trying to learn for this class period? What is it that we're trying to learn for this week? And, to me, I think pedagogically speaking, maintaining a level of attention between you and the students, but not being in their face all the time, allowing them to digest smaller chunks at a time, and giving them plenty of opportunities to express themselves and ask questions. Those are all big things. Um, there's some, and it's different for every course. That's kind of like a top level thing that I think applies everywhere. But so for instance, we have a lot of hands-on courses where we do, like broadcasting or podcasting or writing, and there I really think you have to take advantage of, okay, I'm not maybe not in the room with you, but if you can write something, or maybe broadcast a snippet of yourself, and then I can give you some feedback on how it sounded and how everything worked, and then have you do it again and improve on those things. That ends up being, I think, a really key element of education. One of the things that we've talked about, it was really the start of this show way back in the spring semester, was this idea that if you can work on concepts and then take those concepts to execution and then get repetition on that execution, that is, with guided feedback, that can be as useful of a learning tool as anything, more so than reading a book and providing your thoughts on things. It really is a situation, I think, where practice makes perfect, particularly in the world of media.
Absolutely. And it's a tough year for freshmen trying to get their feet in the door, trying to get used to college life. How have you tried to connect with the freshmen and make sure they still feel involved?
I have done my best within the confines of sports media to reach out via our Canvas page and our email list and say, hey, let's at least have some workshops. Let's have some guest speakers. Let's give you an opportunity to ask questions. We've had a couple of workshops now and one guest speaker, and we've got more guest speakers planned for the next couple of months. So these are outside of the classroom. But the idea is, I don't have the ability necessarily to go into everybody's classroom across the school and say, hey, are you doing okay as a freshman? What can we do to make your time better? So at least within our little area of sports media, and I mean, I say little, there's like 500, 600 people on the email list. Let me at least extend a hand and say, look, you're not alone. Everybody's dealing with these issues. Here's how to think about handling things. Here's what you can work on in the meantime. And then hope that students connect with other students and there's some degree of social interaction there. And it's tough. Look, I cannot imagine being a freshman and this being my first interaction with a college campus. You're living in a dorm and it's one person a room, and you're not really able to interact that often with the people around you potentially. And a lot of your classes, if not all of your classes, are online because they're too big to be in person. And it's like, what am I doing this for? Like, what, this isn't even high school. It's something else entirely. But look, I think everybody's dealing with that. I mean, my daughter is in kindergarten this year and we're doing it online. And let me tell you, that is nowhere close to the same experience that it would have been if she was in person. So I feel like there's no good answers here. You can't, much like we would talk about athletics. You can't just stop playing because you need the money to survive. You can't just stop educating because, young people need the education in order to progress. And even with what we're doing right now, you're going to have people that they're not going to be, 10th graders. They're going to be essentially 9.5 graders, or, like you're missing a lot of that, progression that we're just all used to. It's normally just part of the existence of being that age and being in school. So, look, I think, the hope is that this, like the really severe, restrictions and distancing things will start to dissipate by the time we get to the middle of spring. And maybe for that last 7 or 8 weeks, we might have something that's semi-normal. And then maybe by fall, we're back to more or less business as usual. And that doesn't really make the freshman year for a lot of the people that have gotten here any easier. It does at least, though, give them something to look forward to. And hopefully they're the only ones that are affected by it. And then the next group that comes in will have a relatively normal experience.
That was going to be my follow-up. Do you have any insight on what next semester might look like? Is it more of the same?
So I don't think it's been entirely decided, but I mean, look, I'll say this, like we know that in-person classes aren't starting until the 8th of February. The regular semester, it's essentially the semesters are kind of mirror images of each other, where this semester for those, this is a little different at other universities, but here at IU, the last day of in-person classes is that Friday before Thanksgiving. And then there's 3 weeks of online, and then you've got your winter break, and then you've got an extended week of winter break, and then you got 3 weeks of online only classes to start the semester, and then in person starts on February 8th. So it's not going to be a normal semester by any means. There's no spring break week, and it's essentially 13 weeks straight through once we come back to school. I think the hope is that maybe there's about the same number of hybrid and in-person classes. You've still got primarily online classes, but that sets up a scenario where things are safe enough that summer can be in person, fall can be in person, and then maybe you're back to a relatively normal schedule from that point forward. But kind of like we said with football, there's so many variables that it's almost impossible to predict what exactly is going to happen. Because testing could get really good, and it might be a situation where we feel safer bringing people back. We could have big outbreaks in places, and it might be a situation where we're not in person. But a lot of people thought, myself included, frankly, that we weren't going to be in person at IU for more than a couple of weeks, and like we just started week 6 here at IU. So maybe there's, I think through the crucible of the virus and the pressures surrounding how to fix it, we're figuring out some ways to make this work. So, fingers crossed on that front.
I'm with you. Week 6 is a little surprising that we made it this far, but I think it's a testament to everyone who's made it work. Like I said, you wear many hats. You're now a member of the Name, Image, and Likeness Task Force at IU. They've been making some strides nationally with the NIL movement, but what kind of is your focus on the task force, and kind of what's the goal that they're trying to accomplish?
Well, I think the task force is there to try to prepare athletes at IU for being able to navigate the name, image, and likeness space once we figure out what the rules are. Right now, it's something that's been bandied about quite a bit. There are states where it's allowed. There's a talk of potentially federal legislation, although that might not end up going anywhere. But in the meantime, there's an opportunity, I think, to educate athletes about the value that their brands can have on social media, and to help them figure out, how their social media profiles can be set up, the sorts of things that they should be talking about. And so from my perspective, I'm not a coach, I'm not an administrator in the athletic department, I'm a faculty member. And so, what I try to bring to the table is, I'm very much on the side of let people maximize their own brand potential and financial potential online. Like we wouldn't restrict a regular student from doing this. Why would we restrict an athlete from doing this? But so for me, like a lot of it is the expressive nature of social media and being able to use that professionally, whether it's for your athletics career or whether it's for a business career outside. And what I do is look at examples of how athletes have sufficiently, or excuse me, effectively used it in their professional athletic careers, but also a lot of them have transitioned to media careers because of their utilization of social media. Pat McAfee's being, a great example of that. So I'm there to provide ideas and to try to think about some bigger picture concepts, and also to, just listen to what coaches and athletes have to say about their current situations within this, and try to figure out what the NCAA is going to allow. Because that's ultimately, if IU being a member of the NCAA, it's part of the deal, is that you to some degree have to wait for the governing body to figure out how they want to approach things. And so it's fun to be on the task force, and there's a lot of really smart people on there that know a lot about sports and a lot about social media. So it'll be interesting to see how things move ahead. I think it's a really great sign that IU has put together this type of a task force to try to get out ahead of the curve in terms of arming their athletes with the kinds of knowledge that they would need to be successful.
You're also a podcaster. We see the setup there with the microphone in front of you. One of the few that actually comes in with that big podcast setup. So you obviously talk a lot of Indiana sports. So while I have you here, we have to talk a little Indiana football. It's
Yeah.
within a month from happening. What's your expectation? It's a short season. It's a tough schedule. It felt like going into the year with a normal schedule, there were high expectations on this team. How does that change with a tough 8-game schedule?
So the schedule was going to be tough anyway. None of the games that were scheduled were taken off, and I think my perspective on it is essentially kind of in three parts. Part A is there's a fulcrum point with being an IU observer or an IU fan where you have to, I think, just accept that the team is actually getting good, and that there are it's not just an automatic that Michigan's always going to be better than you, or that Michigan State's always going to be better than you, or that you can't pull an upset. As I think about the Kansas State has now beaten Oklahoma twice in a row, and it's like, you think about that, and then you think, well, IU hasn't beaten Ohio State since 1988, and they haven't beaten Michigan since 1987, and they've only beaten Penn State once since Penn State joined the Big Ten in 1993. And that's where most of the pessimism comes from. But especially in a year like this, it's like, why not? Michigan is down. Michigan State has a new coach. Penn State is going to be playing their first game coming off of quarantine on the road at Memorial Stadium. Even a team like Ohio State, like there's you don't know how they're going to handle the situation. You don't know how, issues relating to the virus or things that are going on campus by campus are going to affect individual teams. So on the one hand, I think, high expectations because so much is coming back for this team, because they've got such dynamic offensive weapons. But I was joking with a friend of mine. I was like, Tom Allen should really take this schedule and print it on the back of a get out of jail free card from a Monopoly set. Because in my opinion, if they go 3-5 in the regular season, I don't really care. It's fine. Like, this is a bonus year. It really is. Everybody's going to come back next year that wants to. Like, everybody gets an extra year of eligibility. And we don't know how things are going to play out with IU. Like, there could be stuff going on behind the scenes. You've had, one situation already where you had a player that had a heart condition coming off of this, I believe, from a couple of months ago. You've had a voluntary shutdown of workouts because of issues related to COVID related things. I just don't think, if you're being reasonable, that you can look at the results from this season and be down on the program, because there are pressures and things going on behind the scenes that we don't know about. Now, none of them may happen, and IU could go 9-0, and I will take that. I will wear it. I will wear the t-shirt from Home Field Apparel proudly. But if things go off the rails, I'm really not that concerned about it.
That's the same point that Zach Osterman made last week. Was they go 3-5, I don't think anyone can clamor about it being a terrible season, because you theoretically, maybe you win the crossover game and you throw your 3 non-conferences hypothetically in there and you're 7-5. So
Yeah. Well,
it,
and look, people are still complaining about Tom Allen and IU football, and they went 8-5 last year.
yep.
Yeah, I mean, it's like they won at Nebraska, they won at Purdue. They like that was one of the best 5 or 6, maybe 7 seasons in IU football history. Like in history, like there's 1945, there's 1967, there's 1987, there's 1993. Those are the only 4 years I think that you could absolutely say were 100% better than what they did last year. You might throw 88 in there because they did win the Liberty Bowl, but like I'm just baffled. And look, I've been critical of Tom Allen. I was suspicious of Allen's ability to do what needed to be done from an organizational perspective after those first 2 years. It felt like they were kind of not going to quite get the boulder over the hill. And I think he silenced any doubts that I had last year with the way the team played. People are going to find a way to complain about IU football regardless, unless they go undefeated. And even then, someone will say, well, they only did that because it was a COVID year. And it's like, dude, that doesn't matter. It really doesn't. So yeah, I think, look, if they underachieve, quote unquote, and only win 3 or 4 games this year, it's fine. It really is. Like, because there are so many things we're not going to know about behind the scenes. And you hope that they're able to take advantage of the situation. I think that it's unfortunate because this ruined what would have been probably an even better season than last year, all things considered. But I'm going to go into every game just being thankful that there's IU football and not really worrying that much about the outcome. I'm going to be more interested in the process and seeing what's happening on the field.
Well, you took my question. I was going to ask you what you thought of Tom Allen, and he's going into year 4. How do you think not only of his first 3 years gone, but how he has handled the offseason with expectations now, and how he has put this team in a position to be successful?
Look, I think Tom Allen has so many positive aspects to him, and it just goes across the board. I mean, he is ultimately the kind of coach that most of the really hardcore IU fans want. And he's also the head coach that a lot of recruits want. And that is a very difficult corner to try to operate on, where you are satisfying both of those groups. He has gotten an excitement going around the program. And to some degree, I think the excitement has grown as the marketing approach has decreased a little bit. The first year was that all the breakthrough messaging and things like that. And then the team goes 5-7. They drop a couple of games that were winnable. And, I think even the year after that, in the second year, there were moments where it's just like, man, it feels like they're a step away. And you just wondered if they were going to be able to pull it off. And then last year, they started to pull those games off more and more. The Nebraska game was probably the best example of
You
that.
and I both thought there's no way they're pulling that one out.
Yeah.
We were there.
And I mean, it wasn't like they blew them out, but they didn't need to. It was a win on the road at Nebraska. And even though Nebraska wasn't great last year, that was one of the tougher environments I've seen a team play in. Just 90,000 fans and everybody going crazy. And, you don't have your best quarterback on the field, but they managed to figure out a way to make it work. They blew out Northwestern at home. They won that bizarre Purdue game. These games mattered. I mean, everybody got a bad taste left in their mouth because of the Gator Bowl loss. None more than me. I mean, I can still remember that angry 20-minute walk back from the stadium to the hotel. It's about as
Me too.
as about as angered as I've been
you
about
got Tennessee
football.
fans singing Rocky Top and yelling at you about how bad your team choked.
That was a rough night. But trying to take that aside, the fact that they were poised to win that game is a good sign. And the fact that they certainly fared better in that game than, say, Purdue did against Auburn in the Music City Bowl a couple of years ago. These things do matter. I mean, that was a big bowl game, relatively speaking, for where IU's been. And so I think, from a recruiting perspective, from a program excitement perspective, from a way that the team is playing perspective, I think Tom Allen gets incredibly high marks. The one area that I still have some questions about is some of the strategic decision making in late game situations, whether that is timeouts or whether that is just situational awareness, like with the onside kick in the Gator Bowl. And it's easy to, you never know. I mean, is an assistant coach calling that, and then the head coach ends up taking the blame. But the really good programs tend to be the ones that don't have those kind of breakdowns. And it can happen. But I think looking across the Big Ten at this point, Allen has acquitted himself about as well as most of his peers. He's won more games than Jeff Brom in the same period. He's won more games than Lovie Smith in the same period. He hasn't been quite as good as PJ Fleck, but I think that Minnesota has a stronger base to operate off of. Like people forget, like that program under Jerry Kill was winning 7, 8, 9 games and going to bowls pretty regularly, whereas IU was not that often under Kevin Wilson. And so I just think that, he'll get better as a head coach and continue to grow. And if the recruiting can continue to be at the level that it's at, you don't have to go out and get 4- and 5-star players. You can make a living off of 3-star players. I mean, Wisconsin and Iowa have done that for a couple of decades now. It's really a matter of talent evaluation. And I think that something that Zach Osterman's pointed out, some other people have pointed out, is the talent evaluation under Kevin Wilson, which is really bad sometimes. Like there were some diamonds in the rough. And I'm not trying to denigrate Kevin Wilson, but there were some recruiting classes that were just vacant in terms of long-term impact players. And that is something that, Tom Allen had to deal with this first couple of years. Like those players were still on the roster. They have started to phase out. And now you're starting to see Allen's first few recruiting classes come through as upperclassmen. And I think this is where I get excited about what the future is, because that is a much higher floor to be operating off of for IU football.
I have my thoughts on this. I've made them pretty available to my closest people, but when you have a team as bad as Indiana for so many years, and then you have a team as good as last year, and I fell into the trap sometimes, but people are clamoring, where are the fans? Where are the fans? It feels like it's going to take a little bit. It's going to take consistent success to bring in Indiana fans. What do you think it will take to, if there's nothing that will take those avid tailgaters into the stadium?
So my feeling is, and I say this as someone who has been going to IU football games since the 80s. My dad and I used to go to games because back in the 80s you couldn't get a ticket to IU basketball, but you could get a ticket to IU football. And we lived a couple hours away, so it was a lot easier to come down. And, the biggest thing I think to keep in mind is that IU football has just kicked its fans in the nuts so often that there's never been a consistent benefit to being an IU football fan. It has very little to do with winning 7 or 8 games in this season or that season. It has something to do with winning consistently year after year. And that's very difficult to do at most places where you don't have a tradition of doing that because there's not the infrastructure in place. You can develop that. I think about Northwestern football or Kansas State football. Or there's a couple of other examples of football. Wisconsin's actually a really good example of this. Football programs that for a long time were not that good consistently. And then they made the commitment financially to, funding things at a level that they needed to be. And they hired the right people and they were able to build off of that. And suddenly football becomes a sport at Northwestern where, they used to be the bottom feeder of the Big Ten in the 70s and 80s. And they have gotten to a point where when they're not in a bowl, you're surprised. Kansas State goes from being a complete afterthought to a perennial bowl team and occasionally a team that can challenge with 8, 9, 10 wins. And that's where you get fans from. Indiana, I think like you're looking at a program that has to have stability, not just in coaching, but stability in success. And I think that's a lot of people have equated those two things. And unfortunately, they're not the same. The idea that you had to look for a coach like Tom Allen who could not just get people excited, but also recruit and win games consistently in order to bring fans in and maintain them. That process is going to take a while. And I think that the idea of getting people, like, people love tailgating at IU football because that's been the fun part of things. And it's like, what's the purpose of coming into the stadium if for the 5 or 4 home games that you're playing, you don't have a chance of beating Ohio State. You don't have a chance of beating Michigan. You don't have a chance of beating Penn State. Like, where's the incentive there? So you have to get the program up to a point where they're at least competitive. Certainly the Big Ten divisional structure does not do that any favors, but that's the reality that you face right now. And until that changes, you're going to have to work around that and figure out a way to make it work. You're not just going to get people, you're not going to get people to just randomly say, I'm going to become an IU football fan, or, hey, they beat Ball State, or, hey, they beat Illinois, I'm going to go become an IU football fan. It doesn't work that way. It is entirely about, this is fun. Following this team is fun. This team winning is fun. And that's where you get people in the stands. That's what happened at Purdue. I mean, 4 years ago, Purdue people were sitting around. There were like 18,000 people in the stands for that bucket game that IU won up there, the one that sent them to the Foster Farms, or maybe it was the Pinstripe Bowl. I forget which one. But, and they're sitting around and like, God, we almost expanded this stadium to 80,000 people. What were we thinking? But now they're fun to watch. Now they beat Ohio State. That's going to bring people in from a home crowd perspective. And they've got to get wins like that. They've got to make it fun regularly to watch IU football. And I think that that's a multi-year process.
I'm glad we're on the same page there, because that's where I stand on it. And I've always said, look, Indiana basketball has an incredible fan base in terms of their devotion to the team. So if you can become a consistent winner, there are devoted fans that wear the cream and crimson that will likely transition to you. Okay, final question before I let you go. It's September 28th. I'll put you on the spot. What is your expectation or prediction for this Indiana football team?
I went on record on my own podcast, Crimson Cast. Be sure to check it out.
And I also went on record at the end, but
I also went on record on the Mind Your Banners podcast. And look, I'm tired of being, I'm tired of couching things in this kind of faux optimism. I have actual reason to be optimistic about this team. And I think when you look at the schedule and the way that it lays out, it's actually not quite as tough as you would think that it is. Because when you look at the power rankings and you look at the projections, IU rates about as well as anybody in the conference, with the exception of Ohio State. So I'm saying 6-2 for the regular season.
Wow.
I think the likelihood is they're going to lose at Ohio State, and they'll probably lose at Wisconsin. I think they can win every other game on the schedule.
Wow.
You've got home games at in your first 4 weeks. You've got home games against Penn State, who IU was in the third quarter against at home a couple of years ago before Michael Penix, got deleted from the football season. And you've got a home game against a Michigan team that has lost a bunch. You've got a road game at Michigan State that's a Michigan State program that I think is going to be in some significant trouble this year. Their projections are terrible. I think they have the second or third lowest win total projection in the whole conference right now. You get Maryland. You get Purdue, obviously, who's, I think, a notch or two below where Indiana's at. You get Rutgers on the road. And that's, Greg Schiano might do some good things with that Rutgers program in week 2 of his first year. I have some questions. So look, I think to some degree, 5-3 in the regular season before you get to that final game is a little more in line with the projections, but the win like over under projections right now are either 5 or 5.5 that I've seen for Indiana. And I think that Indiana is good enough on both sides of the ball, and particularly on their lines, that they can compete with the big boys. And the one other thing I'll say about this, Austin, is that the big daunting task for IU football has been having to go into these cathedrals of football and play games. Well, guess what? Mm-hmm. There probably aren't going to be fans. If there are very few fans in Ohio Stadium, there aren't going to be any fans in Wisconsin, in Camp Randall. There aren't going to be fans in East Lansing. There aren't even going to be bands. Like the Big Ten just announced that they're not going to let bands play in the stadiums. So most of the big scary aspects of things are going to be gone, and it's just going to be two teams playing in a cavernous, empty stadium. With IU's skill position players, I like their chances in some of those games. And it's past time for IU to pull some upsets. Like when Kansas State can knock off Oklahoma. We've been
saying this for years.
Yes, but I'm saying when you can have when Syracuse can beat Clemson at home. What these things happen all the time, but not for Indiana. But there's no reason why they can't happen for Indiana. There's literally no reason. Like there's nothing in the water in Bloomington that says thou shalt not upset top-rated teams.
I think there might be something in the water.
Anyway, I'll just say 6-2, and if I'm wrong, I'm happy to eat it at the end of the year. It won't be the first time I've eaten a positive IU football projection, but I really think that this team has something special. And I'm really excited to see Michael Penix work with this group of skill set players. And I'm really excited to see these lines do what they do. I think there's a lot of reason for optimism with IU football.
I think a lot of it rides on the health of the quarterback. If he gets hurt again, as 6-2 goes out the window, I think really fast. I think I'm the most optimistic pessimist in the world, and that's not even a thing. That doesn't even make any sense, but that's just what Indiana football has turned me into. I get optimistic, and then I'm like, well, then there's no way they're going to win this game. So I think I'd put it at 4-4, but I agree that the metrics are, for some reason, saying it's higher than that. I don't think the metrics aren't people, so they don't know the pain of watching Indiana football. The metrics are just going to throw out wins against Michigan and Penn State that we all know probably won't happen. You think they might happen. But.
Well, I mean, I don't see why not, because if you think about it, IU was a couple of plays away from beating Michigan State last year. And but that was against a team coached by a coach that's been there for 10 or 12 years, who's gone now. And that Michigan State team lost a lot. There's a lot of internal problems with that.
They're one of my wins.
Yeah.
I'm not too worried about Michigan State.
They almost beat Michigan a couple of years ago. They've been really close against Michigan. And again, I just don't feel like there's a huge advantage there with Michigan. Even a team like Penn State, I don't think Penn State is an unbeatable team. I think they're very good, but there have been other very good Penn State teams that have gotten tested at least against Indiana in the past. And so, look, I think if IU takes care of the games that they need to take care of, and that's always been the question mark, and they did that last year, I don't see why they wouldn't also do it this year. And pulling an upset here or there, if you're going to do it in any year, do it in a COVID year. It's as liable to happen now as it would be at any other point. And look, IU has practiced pretty much the whole time, whereas some of their opponents are in situations where they're not able to practice. And that does give you some kind of a competitive advantage moving into October.
You've been in this longer than me, but I'm just in the boy who cried wolf scenario every time. I can recall the double overtime Michigan game, the overtime Michigan game, the low scoring punt bowl with Penn State, and last year's Penn State game. They put themselves in the positions and don't deliver. So I need a little bit of evidence before I can buy in, I think.
Oh, I don't blame you. I would feel the same way. My thought process is last year I picked 5-7 and they went 8-4.
I think I said 4-8 last year. So yeah, I was with you.
And a lot of that trepidation was, they can't win at Nebraska. They can't win at Purdue. They can't, they're going to struggle in this game or that game. And they ended up doing really well in those games. I mean, there were very few games where they looked outclassed. The Ohio State game, the Michigan game, but they really came to play on a lot of other occasions. And so, look, I think if they'd lost a bunch from last year, it'd be a different story. But they didn't. I mean, they really didn't lose anybody.
That's fair.
Of absolute note. Obviously, Peyton Ramsey, that's a bit of a loss. But look, you were going to pick Michael Penix to be your starting quarterback anyway this year. So to me, it's not a loss. It's just, okay, now you've got one quarterback and you just hope that Michael Penix has put on enough weight and had enough time in the practice room that he can stay healthy throughout the course of the year.
Well, we could go back and forth on this, I think, for another hour, but
that's what the people want.
Yeah, this is what Indiana fans want to listen to, is you and I bantering about 6-2 or 4-4 the upcoming season that's still a month away. But really appreciate you coming on. Make sure you check out Galen's podcast, Crimson Cast. They do this. They talk about what we just talked about there for hours, and it's great. So go listen to that. And really appreciate Dr. Galen Clavio coming on our podcast here today. Thanks so much.
Thanks, Austin.
We'll wrap things up here on our Monday episode. Make sure you can check out all of our episodes on the IU Sports Media YouTube page or on the Spotify, Spreaker, Apple Podcasts, wherever you want to find us, we are there. A reminder, this is a huge week of sports. The MLB playoffs is underway starting, I believe, tomorrow. The NBA Finals is coming up between the Heat and the Lakers. College football, obviously, continuing. NFL, big game tonight, Ravens and Chiefs. Uh, this is just a great time for sports. So make sure you get in front of a screen, like Dr. Clavio said, make it a priority because there are some really good sports happening. And there's a lot of hardworking people that are making these sports happen, especially in the bubble, in the WNBA bubble, the NBA bubble, the NHL bubble. There's a lot of people making these things happen, and they're working really hard. And you know what? They're getting rewarded with some really good sports. So make sure you enjoy some sports this weekend. I know, or this week. I know I will. Every day feels like the weekend because I'm stuck in quarantine. But we'll be back on Wednesday. Kyle Porter of CBS Sports will be coming on to talk a little bit of golf in what is kind of a downtime after we went through a furious stretch there. A couple majors, the FedEx Cup playoffs. We'll talk with Kyle Porter about all things golf on Wednesday. Thanks for checking us out here on a Monday episode. Have a great rest of your week. We'll see you on Wednesday for Dr. Clavio. I'm Austin Render saying so long from Unpaid Interns.